This is the second of 4 videos dealing with demography, and again what I would like all of you to be reading is chapter 2 in the textbook. Let's start out with the learning objectives for this video. There are 3. The first is we are going to talk about some terms. One of them is GDP per capita, another is global north, another is global south, and another is HDI. We will explain all of these, and I would like all of you to be able to understand what they mean. I'd also like all of you to be able to discuss and understand their geographic pattern at a global scale. The second is we're going to be able to identify the relationship between HDI and the crude birth rate. And then finally, towards the end of today's video, we're going to talk about our second demographic marker, and that is the CDR, or the crude death rate. So let's begin. I want to start out with a map of GDP per capita. Most of you know what GDP per capita means. It stands for Gross Domestic Product per capita. It's basically a measurement of wealth. And the way that it's done is you take the total value of an economy in a country over the course of a year, and then you divide it by the number of people. Look at how GDP per capita is measured on this particular map. There are essentially 5 categories. The lowest category is below 1,000 American dollars per year per person, all the way up to greater than 20,000 American dollars per year per person. Now what I want to do first is I want to just look at those places that have exceptionally high GDP per capita. In other words, fall into the red category. You'll notice that there are collections of countries that are adjacent to one another where GDP per capita falls into this highest category. And if you look at it this way, there are basically 4 main nodes, places where GDP per capita is very high. The first is the United States and Canada. Both have exceptionally high GDP per capita. That means they're basically very wealthy countries, at least on average. The second is Europe, again broadly defined, especially Western Europe in particular. The third, way over here, is Japan. Japan also has exceptionally high GDP per capita. And the fourth is Australia. Now you're probably thinking, why did I ignore this country and why did I ignore this country? That's the United Arab Emirates and Israel. There's a reason. They're comparatively tiny and they have comparatively small populations. Now, there's one more thing I would like to do. One of the ways that we are going to talk about the places on this map that are represented with the darkest red is they are the most powerful, at least economically, parts of planet Earth, at least right now. And collectively, those 4 regions, the United States and Canada, Europe, Japan, and Australia, might also be called the economic core of the global economy. We'll talk about that a little bit later on in the semester, but for now, just understand that those 4 regions together are somewhat unique globally in terms of their relatively high levels of wealth and also their economic power. Now there's another set of terms that capture this idea of exceptionally high wealth versus areas that aren't so wealthy, and it has to do with something that geographers call the global north versus the global south. This is an unusual projection. It's basically centered on the North Pole, but what it allows us to do is draw this thick red line, and then everything that's basically captured by that red line is essentially north of that red line. All of these places fall into that red category on the previous map. Notice you've got Western Europe. You also have the United States and Canada, and you also have Japan. If you notice here, there's kind of an interesting geographical trick. They swooped it down to include as well Australia. Collectively, those regions together are referred to as the global north. So what we mean by the global north then is those parts of the world that are, as they say it here, more developed. But perhaps a better way of putting it is they all have high GDP per capita. They're basically wealthy countries. South of that red line, you have the so-called global south. So Mexico is in the global south, the United States is in the global north. All of Latin America technically is in the global south. Even Eastern Europe and Russia, because they do have lower GDPs per capita, are also in the global south. Even China. A lot of people are under the false impression that China is a rich country. It is not. Parts of China are wealthy, in particular the east coast of China, but most of it is relatively impoverished. And the result is that the average GDP per capita is relatively low. So knowing the distinction between global north and global south is going to help us understand the pattern of some of these demographic markers. To summarize, global north are those 4 areas or regions that we identified in the previous slide that all consistently have high GDP per capita. Now, there's one final thing we need to do before we get back to our demographic markers. There's another way of measuring overall well-being that includes more than just GDP per capita, and it's called HDI. What HDI stands for is the Human Development Index, and what it is a somewhat more comprehensive way of measuring the quality of life and the overall well-being. In addition to GDP per capita, it also includes the overall level of education, access to healthcare. It also includes gender equality, literacy, nutrition, and a variety of other ways of measuring the quality of life. Now, the way that HDI is typically represented is it ranges from 0 to 1. So the highest HDI you could ever see is 1. No country ever has 1 for their HDI, but the highest typically are 0.9 and above. You'll notice that the pattern of HDI looks a lot like the pattern of GDP per capita. So the United States and Canada, Western Europe, Japan, and Australia fall into the highest category. Again, collectively, those 4 are in the so-called global north. Anything below that highest category, basically there's a lot of diversity there, but what we're going to do in a shorthand kind of way is everything else falls into the so-called global south. That pattern, global north versus global south, is going to help us make sense of the variation in the crude birth rate. So let's return finally to the crude birth rate, and what I would like us to do now is see how in many ways the crude birth rate and the variation of the crude birth rate moves in the exact opposite direction of HDI. Notice that both the United States and Canada, Europe, Japan, Australia, they fall into the lowest category, whereas those places in the global south tend to fall into these higher categories. So just to give an example, again, Madagascar, Somalia, and Afghanistan. They're all in the global south. They are all also in the highest category. So the relationship you need to understand is this one. HDI and the crude birth rate are inversely related. As one goes up, the other goes down. There are a lot of reasons why that is the case, and we'll get to that eventually, but I want to point out just one. Typically, as a country becomes wealthier, it's also a place where there is also a change in the culture. Instead of the culture being based on agriculture and communalism, it becomes a much more individualistic culture that's focused on materialism, individualism, careerism, and education. And so, if you think about it that way, what it means is that a high fertility rate tends to work in a way that is inimical to wealth. And so you can see why the two are going to be connected in this kind of way. To rephrase it, one way of thinking about how you might predict the crude birth rate is to basically just know the level of wealth. If the level of wealth is low, expect to see a high crude birth rate, and of course the opposite is true as well. Okay, let's wrap up this particular video by looking at our second demographic marker, and that is going to be the crude death rate. Notice that the crude death rate is represented in a very similar way to the crude birth rate. It's deaths per 1,000 people per year. There is also another way of talking about the crude birth rate. It is sometimes called the mortality rate, but to be consistent, I will always call the crude death rate, or I'll sometimes abbreviate it as the CDR. Firstly, let's look at the legend. As you can see here, the crude death rate has exactly 4 categories, and it's represented here by a kind of progression of darker and darker reds. So the way we're going to do it is kind of very similar to what we did with the crude birth rate. The darkest red category, which is 20 and above, we will call that a high crude death rate. The middle 2 categories we will call a moderate crude death rate. And the lowest category, this kind of gray scale, we will call, in this case it's below 10, a low crude death rate. So let's look at the United States. It's color-coded gray. That means it has a low crude death rate. Russia, which falls into this category right here, between 15 and 19, that means Russia has a moderate crude death rate. And then let's pick Angola. Angola is in that highest category, which is 20 and above. That means Angola has a high crude death rate. Now, one of the things that I want to finish up with before we move on to the next video presentation is this. What is the relationship between HDI and the crude death rate? Well, guess what? It's exactly the same as it was as the relationship between HDI and the crude birth rate. As HDI goes up, typically the crude death rate goes down. The opposite is true as well. If you have a relatively low HDI, you might expect a relatively high crude death rate. So they are also tied together in an inverse relationship. There are some exceptions to the rule, but in general, as wealth goes up, the crude death rate goes down. And I'm sure you all can figure out why this is. As wealth goes up, you have better access to medical care. You have better access to nutrition. And so outcomes with regard to life expectancy and also in terms of longevity tend to be associated with a higher level of wealth and overall well-being.